is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories. U.S. forces say Iranian ports are now fully blockaded, cutting off sea trade. Now, President Trump says the war is very close to over, signaling more talks ahead, while China stresses the need to avoid renewed fighting. Now, Japan to launch a $10 billion plan to help Asia secure energy as the Middle East conflict chokes off supplies. And South Korea locks in 270 million barrels of oil with supplies routed outside Hormuz. Seoul, meantime, says that March import prices rose at the fastest pace in more than 3 years amid the energy supply disruption. And President Xi meets Vietnam's top leader To Lam in Beijing, signing deals on security, customs, and tech, as he urged both countries to protect global supply chains. Also tonight, a South Korean cosmetics firm that chose a different path emerges a winner amid the turmoil of the Middle East.
I'm Deborah Wong in Guangzhou. It's been a busy first day here at the Canton Fair, the world's largest and China's longest-running trade show. We'll be tracking sales, turnout, new tech on display to get a sense of where China's export sector is headed. All this as global uncertainty deepens, fueled by an energy crisis linked to the war involving Iran. We'll unpack all this and more later in the show.
The U.S. naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz in its second day, with Washington saying that it has completely halted all economic trade in and out of Iran. This as President Donald Trump signals the war is close to over, hinting at possible new talks with Tehran later this week. Well, the U.S. leader told the New York Post that American and Iranian officials could be meeting over the next 2 days, and that negotiations will likely take place in Pakistani capital, Islamabad. He has also indicated he was not thinking about extending the current ceasefire with Iran, which expires in about 7 days. Well, Iran has yet to confirm whether it will return to the negotiating table. Pakistan says it remains committed to facilitating talks. The first round in Islamabad last weekend ended without a breakthrough. Well, despite diplomatic signals, pressure on Iran is intensifying. More vessels are being turned away under the U.S. blockade, including a sanctioned Chinese-owned tanker that reversed course near the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command says the blockade has been fully implemented, cutting off nearly all maritime trade that accounts for about 90% of Iran's economy. At least 6 ships have already been forced to turn back, though some other vessels managed to cross the strait. Iranian media reports the country will use alternative ports to those in southern Iran to bypass the blockade. China, which Mr. Trump had credited for nudging Iran into talks, repeated its call for a return to diplomacy and urged the resumption of navigation in the strait.
当务之急是全力避免战端重启，尽快恢复霍尔木兹海峡通行和海湾地区和平稳定，防止对全球经济和能源安全造成更大的冲击，甚至引发人道主义危机。
Now, an expert CNA spoke with explains Beijing's position on the conflict and what it could offer diplomatically.
There are 2 things. One is Beijing might see that the U.S. blockade is putting pressure on oil prices and indeed its supply of fossil fuels from the Middle East. That creates pressure. At the same time, given that the U.S. and Iranian sides seem interested in talking, there appears to be momentum that Beijing seems happy, willing to sort of usher along. So that's, I guess, what Beijing sees as the opportune time for them to be more openly sort of active. Before they talked about mediation and all that, but they kept a pretty low profile. Now with Xi Jinping speaking, they're really uplifting the sort of role or the visibility of the role that they wish to play. The 4-point plan, it lays out principles, but I think in essence, they're adding momentum, they're adding sort of push towards negotiation. And I suppose that's about as much as they are willing to do for now. For now, they could decide to do more later because they also probably don't want to be caught up more directly in tensions between, or the differences between Iran and the U.S., bearing in mind that Xi Jinping is looking to welcome U.S. President Trump to Beijing soon. So, it's a pretty delicate situation for them. The broad principles are fine. Trying to usher along talks are fine, but to potentially get involved in ways that could be difficult to manage and control, I think Beijing would be a little bit careful there.
Well, China has been hosting a string of leaders amid the war in the Middle East, including Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Well, the top diplomat met Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing this morning. Amid the ongoing supply uncertainties due to the war in the Middle East, Mr. Lavrov said that Russia stands ready to assist.
Россия может, безусловно, восполнить недостаток ресурсов, который возник и у Китайской Народной Республики, и у других стран, которые заинтересованы с нами работать на равноправной, взаимовыгодной основе.
Russia's top diplomat also met Foreign Affairs Minister Wong yesterday. Well, they condemned the war and also discussed the economic implications of the energy crisis, calling for unimpeded navigation through the strait. Japan has unveiled a $10 billion package to help Asian countries secure oil as tensions over the Strait of Hormuz tighten global supplies. Well, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi says that the support will take the form of loans channeled through state-backed institutions such as the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. The initiative aims to steady regional supply chains and, in turn, shield Japan's economy as concerns mount over spillover effects on industries such as healthcare. And for the details, let's bring in CNA's senior correspondent, Michiyo Ishida, live from Tokyo. Michiyo, what more do we know about Japan's multi-billion-dollar package?
Well, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi told reporters in order to procure crude oil at any time, financial and credit strength are important. So Japan decided to provide a $10 billion package. She said it's equivalent to 1.2 billion barrels or 1 year worth of crude oil Asia imports. She wants to pave the way to expand Asia's oil reserves, to set up a release system, and to build oil tanks. She also wants to secure a supply chain for rare minerals, biofuel, diversify energy sources to aim for zero carbon emission. And she named the project Power Asia. Now, a stable supply of crude oil for countries in Asia benefits Japan, as it procured much of its medical supplies derived from petroleum from countries in Asia. Now, Ms. Takaichi named tools for artificial dialysis, for surgeries, and medical gloves. In Japan, medical industry has been starting to express concerns of shortage of such supplies. Ms. Takaichi said a strong supply chain in Asia will support Japan's economy, and also her administration's aim for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Also, Ms. Takaichi, well, she's also set her sights on economic opportunities beyond Asia. So I'm curious to know what came out of those talks with the Polish Prime Minister.
Yes, well, the Polish Prime Minister was here, and let's take a listen to what the two leaders said in their joint statement in Tokyo.
ポーランドとの関係を包括的戦略的パートナーに格上げすることといたしました。幅広い分野での連携を一層強化してまいります。
I dzisiaj, kiedy Polska stała się niekwestionowanym liderem wzrostu gospodarczego, kiedy przeskoczyliśmy kilka epok, jeśli chodzi o rozwój cywilizacyjny, możemy z dumą powiedzieć, że z Japonią stanowimy parę partnerską, taką, w którym jak równy z równym rozmawiać możemy i będziemy o współpracy gospodarczej, współpracy w zakresie bezpieczeństwa, nauki i kultury.
Prime Minister Tusk and Prime Minister Takaichi met for the first time, and they upgraded their relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership from a 2015 strategic partnership. Now, Tokyo says On the back of Poland's economic growth, there are 400 branches of Japanese companies in Poland today. Now, Prime Minister Tusk said earlier he met with Japanese business leaders. To facilitate business exchanges, they signed a Social Security agreement. Employees sent to respective countries for less than 5 years don't have to pay into the pension system of both countries anymore, but only to the country they come from. And this is aimed to reduce burdens on companies and employees. They want to deepen economic cooperation on infrastructure, to enhance regional connectivity and advance technologies such as AI. As Poland is a hub to support Ukraine, Ms. Takaichi vowed to cooperate on energy, supply chain, and housing for a lasting peace in Ukraine. Now, in a statement released, they said that they also discussed the situation in the Indo-Pacific, such as China, and expressed concerns towards increasing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. On the Middle East situation, they stressed the importance of de-escalation and safety of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz.
Many thanks for that report. CNA Senior Correspondent Michiyo Ishida speaking to us live from Tokyo. We're going to go for a short break now, but coming up in East Asia tonight, Japanese refineries looking to mix and match crudes as their operations run short of feedstock from their usual sources in the Persian Gulf. And China's importing more chip-making equipment from Southeast Asia now than from the U.S. amid tech rivalry between the two biggest economies in the world. Hello again. Time now for your business news. Oil futures gaining ground with investors weighing chances of U.S.-Iran peace talks resuming while awaiting U.S. inventory data. While physical oil still trading at significant premiums to futures prices, refiners have been desperately seeking alternatives to crude supply, seeking supplies from elsewhere, including the U.S. Gulf Coast and the North Sea. Well, that's as the U.S. naval blockade has stopped at least 2 oil tankers from leaving Iran yesterday. Well, the market reportedly may lose access to further supply after 2 U.S. administration officials said that Washington will not renew a 30-day waiver of sanctions on Iranian oil at sea that expires this week, and quietly let a similar waiver on sanctions on Russian oil expire over the weekend. Now, South Korea's import prices posted their biggest surge in nearly 3 decades, underscoring cost pressures rippling through the economy amid the war in the Middle East. Now, import prices rose 16% on month in March. That's the fastest increase since January 1998, and they're up over 18% year on year. Raw materials led the gains, with crude and mining products surging more than 40% on month. Now, oil products, including naphtha and jet fuel, also jumped, adding to cost pressures for manufacturers. Well, let's look at export prices. That rose 16.3% on month, driven by higher energy costs and strong semiconductor demand. Well, they surged about 28% on year. The jump basically reflecting higher global crude prices and a weaker won, which fell about 2.6% against the US dollar in March. Well, authorities are preparing fiscal support to cushion the economy from the Middle East shock. Experts say that raising the risk of policy divergence if the Bank of Korea responds to mounting price pressures. Meantime, South Korea has secured 273 million barrels of crude from 4 Middle Eastern countries and 2.1 million tons of naphtha through year-end. Officials say the crude supply can sustain the economy for over 3 months under normal conditions. Well, the war on Iran is also raising the cost of anything linked to oil, and that includes plastics. As plastic prices soar, firms in South Korea are looking for alternatives, and this inadvertently turning its packaging industry into a more eco-friendly one.
In South Korea, the fates of 2 cosmetics industry companies shows how the turmoil creates winners and losers. At Gawon International, a face mask packaging manufacturer, some machines in its Pyeongtaek facility have ground to a halt. The factory is facing a shortage of plastic film due to the Middle East crisis. Sales team manager Han Kyung-hoon said the factory has slashed output to about 10 to 20% of normal levels.
제일 걱정되는 건 사실 제품 만들어서 출고를 해야지 뒤에 공정들에서도 생산을 하시고 완제품을 만들어서 담아서 파실 텐데 그런 것도 다 현재 많이 지연되고 못하는 상황이 된 거죠. 저희도 이제 매출이 없어지는 거고.
The 20-year-old factory is now telling its clients that they may need to wait up to 8 weeks for orders versus 2 weeks previously. Han said that even if the war ended immediately, they would likely need 1 or 2 months to recover. The situation at Yeonwoo, another company that makes packaging for cosmetics, is very different. Kim Min-sang, a senior manager at parent company Kolmar Korea, said inquiries for its paper-based line of tubes and pouches have gone up threefold. He expects demand to continue to rise.
처음에 종이 패키지는 친환경 또는 지속 가능성, ESG 이런 이슈로 인해서 개발을 시작했고 여기에 대한 고객사들의 수요도 늘어나고 있는 상황이었는데요. 지금 플라스틱 수급의 문제가 이슈가 있는 이 상황에 저희가 가지고 있는 종이 대체 소재는 앞으로 큰 기대가 되고 있습니다.
China, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia used almost a third of the world's plastic in 2022, OECD data showed. Now, war has prices soaring, and firms are on the hunt for alternatives. When peace returns, the world will find out whether that's a temporary switch or the start of lasting change.
Now, Japan's oil industry is under pressure with the country's refineries running well below capacity. The slowdown highlights just how difficult it is for Japan to replace its heavy reliance on Middle Eastern oil, which typically accounts for about 95% of imports. Now, the refineries are running at just under 68% of capacity, well below the more than 80% levels seen before the conflict started in late February. Now, while the government has tapped international reserves and secured alternative supplies, refineries face technical limits. Most plants were built decades ago to process medium sour crude from the Middle East. New oil is coming mainly from the United States, along with countries like Brazil, Nigeria, and Malaysia. The refiners can mix the Middle Eastern crudes with a light sweet crude from the US and West Africa, along with some medium grades from the Caspian region and parts of Latin America, though the shift will increase yields of gasoline and naphtha and reduce diesel and jet output. Now, Hengyi Petrochemical, which is a major Chinese oil products manufacturer, recording a nearly 40-fold jump in profit for the first quarter, as it benefits from the sharp rise in its products' prices due to the war in the Middle East. Now, revenue for the first quarter at $4.3 billion, up by 16% on year, while net adjusted profit came in at $288 million, up close to 4,000%. Hengyi enjoys a sourcing advantage in that it owns a petrochemical complex in Brunei, which feeds its downstream facilities, and increased demand for products made from diesel has widened its profit margins by an enormous amount. Now, Hengyi's share price rose by about 50% from its recent low of 10.45 yuan on March 20th to close the day at above 15 yuan. Well, China's imports of chip-making equipment from Southeast Asia surged amid trade tensions with Washington. But a closer look shows that the money trail still leads back to the U.S. Now, Malaysia overtook the U.S. last year as China's fourth largest source of chip-making equipment, with Beijing importing over $3.4 billion worth, more than double the amount on year. Singapore remains third position at $5.7 billion, while the Netherlands took the top spot at almost $10 billion. Despite relocating production away from China since 2023 due to U.S. export controls, China is still a major market for American chip equipment makers, with the top three firms logging in some $19 billion in revenue for fiscal 2025. Experts, however, say that China is looking to become self-sufficient in its semiconductor supply chain. Its own chip equipment makers' revenue ballooned in recent years, but like many sectors, it risks falling victim to so-called involution, where stiff competition drives down prices in a race to the bottom. Well, the International Monetary Fund has cut its growth outlook for the world, warning that the conflict in the Middle East could push the global economy to the brink of a recession. Well, the risks are especially high for Asia, where momentum is slowing. Nick Harper has been following this story for CNA, and he sends this report from Washington.
grim reading meant very little fanfare for the unveiling of the IMF's signature report, the World Economic Outlook. The IMF had planned an outlook upgrade, spurred on by increased tech investment and lower interest rates. The Middle East conflict has changed that calculation.
We were looking to lift up our global growth forecast. Now, war in the Middle East has halted this momentum. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz and serious damage to critical energy facilities in the Middle East raised the prospect of a major energy crisis should a durable solution not be found soon.
6 weeks of fighting in the Middle East have put the brakes on global growth. The IMF downgrading 2026 global growth from 3.3 to 3.1%. Growth in emerging and developing Asia is projected to slow from 5.5% last year to 4.9% this year. There are downgrades for India and China in 2026, down more than 1 percentage point and 0.5% respectively compared to 2025. China, in particular, still struggling from soft domestic demand.
And that reflects some of the domestic imbalances in that economy between an export sector that is doing quite well. There have been very strong performance on the export side, but a domestic side of the economy, domestic consumption, that's still fairly weak. And going forward, that's becoming more and more of a headwind for the Chinese economy.
The IMF highlighted a growing imbalance in Asia between tech winners and countries vulnerable to global shocks. Some Southeast Asian economies are expected to be hit hard by the conflict's knock-on effects, with an expected reduction in tourism and remittance inflows. On the upside, Asian economies have benefited from robust global trade. Technology-related exports like semiconductors and AI-related tech have helped boost Taiwan and Vietnam. But the IMF warned the longer shipping disruptions continue in the Strait of Hormuz, the worse the outlook will get. A longer conflict creating a close call for a global recession.
In a nutshell, risks have increased. Markets are adjusting to the war in the Middle East with higher energy prices and renewed inflation concerns. All of this has pushed bond yields up and weighed on risk asset prices. While markets have been orderly to date, global financial conditions could tighten more if the conflict persisted.
That severe scenario would see oil prices remain high, major financial market disruptions, and a tightening of financial conditions worldwide. In that scenario, the fund warned that global growth would fall as low as 2%, something that's only happened 4 times since 1980. For CNA, I'm Nick Harper in Washington.
Well, time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, the Chinese president welcomes Vietnam's leader to Beijing. Our correspondents break down the complex ties between the two communist nations and why they are seeking to strengthen their relationship. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The U.S. shuts off Iranian maritime trade in the Strait of Hormuz, even as Donald Trump signals imminent talks with Tehran to end the war. Japan and South Korea ramping up measures to mitigate the energy crunch. Tokyo setting up a $10 billion financial support framework for Asian countries, while Seoul locks in 270 million barrels of oil, bypassing Hormuz. And South Korea's import prices post their biggest surge in nearly 30 years, underscoring energy cost pressures and are heightening concerns over consumer inflation. Chinese President Xi Jinping has signed a series of deals with visiting Vietnamese leader To Lâm. Well, they cover sectors including public security, supply chains, and technology. Both leaders held talks earlier today at Beijing's Great Hall of the People, with President Xi saying that Beijing is willing to adopt a comprehensive strategic cooperation with Vietnam. The Chinese leader added that both sides should jointly oppose unilateralism and work to safeguard global supply chains. Mr. Xi also said that China welcomes more Vietnamese products to be brought into the Chinese market. Well, Mr. Lâm has said that deepening ties with Beijing is a strategic choice and top priority. Last week, Mr. Xi sent a congratulatory message to Mr. Lâm for being elected as president. offering to continue strengthening their socialist causes. And we've got our correspondent, Krystal Chia. She has been tracking the story and now joins us live from Shanghai. So, Krystal, it appears that Mr. Lam has had a packed itinerary so far. Tell us in a nutshell what was achieved during the meetings and what's been said.
So there are no immediate specific details as of yet, but earlier other media had reported, citing sources, that these agreements could be on telecom infrastructure, aviation. State media said that Mr. Lam had called ties with Beijing a top priority. This is something that he has reiterated throughout his trip. For example, he was giving a speech at Beijing's Tsinghua University, and he said that it was necessary to strengthen the political and social foundations. Now, he also published an article in China's People's Daily newspaper calling the relationship a strategic priority. Now, on the Chinese side, President Xi said that the two sides should defend the global free trade system, his remarks coming against a backdrop of global upheaval in the trade and energy markets.
Also, both sides, they seem to have made several calls to strengthen their relationship. Walk us through the motivations for that.
So the background to this is that China is Vietnam's largest trading partner and second largest source of foreign investment. And with the turmoil in energy markets, there were expectations that both sides will seek reassurance that there will be minimal disruption to existing cooperation. Or for Hanoi to ask Beijing for help with energy security. This is especially so as Vietnam relies heavily on imported oil and gas. So far, China has provided some relief in the form of distillate fuels to Vietnam, even as it tightens export controls more broadly. But Vietnam is navigating a balancing act. Bilateral trade reached a record last year, showing Vietnam's reliance on Chinese imports, just as it also exports to the U.S. And not to forget that the two countries also have rival territorial claims in the South China Sea. Oteli?
Hey, thanks for helping us unpack China-Vietnam relations. CNA Correspondent Krystal Chia in Shanghai. Well, Mr. Lam chose China for his first official overseas visit as both head of state and chief of the country's Communist Party. CNA's senior correspondent Wai Kit explains how this trip fits into Vietnam's broader position on the global stage.
Vietnam's President Tô Lâm may have chosen China for his first trip as head of state, just as he did in 2024 after becoming party chief. But that alone does not signal Vietnam's alignment with any single country. One Vietnam-China watcher points out that traditionally, newly elected leaders in Vietnam often choose China as their first overseas visit. Another Vietnam expert notes it's firmly in Hanoi's interest to balance superpower rivalry in what's known as its bamboo diplomacy.
Vietnam has been trying hard to maintain such a balance. Normally, whenever a Vietnamese leader pays a visit to either U.S. or China, they will send someone else or another delegation to the other power to show that they are trying to maintain a balance. In the case of Mr. Tô Lam's visit to China, we should take into consideration the fact that before he was elected head of state by the National Assembly, he paid a visit to the U.S. in February to participate in the inaugural meeting of the Border Peace and paid a working visit to the U.S.
Beyond reaffirming ties with China, Vietnam is also seeking to boost economic opportunities. Among them, seeking energy cooperation, supply chain management and infrastructure development. While Mr. Lam is expected to maintain this careful balance, his role as head of state also requires him to navigate ongoing tensions with major partners. With the United States, there's continued uncertainty, including the risk of tariffs. And with China, the South China Sea dispute remains a persistent sticking point.
Vietnam's strategy has always been to isolate the South China Sea disputes from overall relationship and to focus on political and economic cooperation.
Other analysts say Vietnam has demonstrated its ability to compartmentalize conflict and diplomacy and is likely to stand firm on issues of national importance. When it comes to China, one observer says Hanoi's ties with Beijing will continue to be driven largely by economic cooperation, a key priority for Vietnam as it targets the ambitious annual growth of around 10% and aims to achieve high income status by 2045. Wai Kit, CNA.
In other news, China has called the United States' claims that it's exerting military pressure on Taiwan a distortion. Last week, the U.S. State Department called for Beijing to stop its military and other pressures on the island and engage in dialogue with Taiwan. But China rejected the criticism, saying the accusations reflect Washington's malicious intentions. It insisted that Taiwan is an internal affair and urged Washington to act with caution. China, meantime, has stepped up military activity around the self-ruled island it claims as its own, and that includes multiple rounds of war games and recent live fire drills. Taiwan has responded by strengthening its defenses. It's planning to buy more arms from the U.S., its main supplier, a move that angers Beijing. Now, Mr. Xi's government refuses to speak to the island's president, William Lai, choosing instead to host opposition leader Zheng Liwen instead. Taipei says it should be leading engagement efforts with Beijing rather than private party-to-party contacts. For her part, Ms. Zheng said that her trip aims to promote peace. Top naval chiefs from the U.S., South Korea and Japan are expected to meet in Seoul today to discuss ways to bolster defense cooperation. Military officials say the three men will exchange assessments on the maritime security environment in the Pacific region. South Korea's Navy chief will also hold separate bilateral meetings with his American and Japanese counterparts. And talks could potentially veer into developments in the Middle East as tensions escalate over the Strait of Hormuz following Washington's recent blockade. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump urged allies South Korea and Japan to deploy warships to help safeguard key shipping lanes. Seoul says no formal request has been made regarding the dispatch of troops, while Tokyo says nothing has been decided yet. Rafael Grossi, chief of UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, says that North Korea has made, quote, very serious advances in its ability to produce nuclear weapons as it ramps up operations at its Yongbyon nuclear complex.
The operation of the light water reactor and the activation of other facilities apart from Yongbyon, all of them point to a very serious increase in the capabilities of the DPRK in the area of nuclear weapons production, which is estimated at a few dozen warheads.
Mr. Grossi separately noted the lack of evidence that Russian technology has made its way into Pyongyang's atomic program. Turning to Iran, he stressed that a thorough verification regime for Tehran's ambitious nuclear program is needed in a possible U.S.-Iran agreement, failing which the nuclear chief says it would be, quote, an illusion of an agreement. The warning comes as U.S. leader Donald Trump says that a second round of talks with Iran could happen soon. Well, the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has left Asia scrambling with one of its worst energy crises in decades. Earlier, CNA spoke with Amos Hochstein, managing partner at TWG Global, and he was an energy and investment advisor to former U.S. President Joe Biden. Well, he says nations, including the U.S. and China, should work together to build alternative energy infrastructure.
I'm very, very nervous about the fact that the U.S. is abdicating its role as a leader, but I don't lose hope. I still think that that is the right role for us. Look, I think China is going to want to play that role, and I think that instead of China playing that role alone, or the United States playing it alone, I think this should actually be an area where the U.S. and China can work together. This is something where we are, when it comes to energy markets and financial markets, we are one world. We cannot have a financial crisis in Asia and not have that affect the U.S. markets, and vice versa. We are integrated whether we like it or not. So I think this is a moment where I'm not calling on this for the U.S. to do it without China. I think that if the U.S. doesn't do it with China, China will do it without the United States. And that will be a big mistake for everyone. I think it will be a bad idea for the United States, but I actually think globally it will be a mistake. We should integrate energy systems and infrastructure, not isolate them.
And from an Asian perspective, where countries are already, cutting industrial output and flights, what should governments here be prioritizing right now to cushion the impact of this shock?
Well, one, I think that they should be very honest about what's happening. And I think that there's a cheerleading going on in the market every day. Oh, there's optimism. We're going to have talks in a couple of days. The talks don't matter. The PR doesn't matter. What matters is that the straits are still closed. There is no products coming to Asia for several weeks. So I think there should be an emergency or an urgency, rather, to government actions across the region. They should be bringing the industry together. They should have meetings with the financial leaders, with corporate leaders to understand and get a reality check. How many days do we have before jet fuel is running out? How much time do we have before inputs? There was a leading company in Japan that has announced that it cannot continue manufacturing of things like bathtubs and toilets because they don't have the inputs. There are companies in Malaysia that cannot continue to manufacture surgical gloves. This is the beginning signs. And I think I get that there's always a nervousness. Look, I worked in the White House. There's a nervousness to send a message of panic to the market. But if you don't act with urgency and the straits are closed for another week or 2 weeks, that could have devastating impact. And so I think it's important to get ahead of that and understand from corporations and manufacturers how many days before they run out of inputs, and to communicate that to see what they can do to help resolve it.
Well, CNA's Arnold Gay and Roland Lim discussed how China stands to gain and whether the energy crisis could drive lasting changes in this week's episode of CNA's Correspondent podcast.
There are some who believe that China is the potential winner here, in this region, which is highly dependent on oil, and gas from the Middle East. I'm wondering, how might Beijing, use this energy crisis, which the Americans created, of course, to build a more favorable environment for, its own interests, whether it's economic or whether it's military in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, China's opportunity is not mainly as a fuel superpower. It is actually the industrial and strategic supplier of new fuels. I mean, first of all, Beijing can present itself as a country that saw this coming. I mean, President Xi Jinping now openly urging the faster development of new energy systems, stressing wind, solar, hydropower, nuclear, diversify energy security, basically. And that's the message for the region, that if you want less exposure to the Middle East turmoil, electrify faster, and China can sell you the kit to do it. I mean, there was a recent Johns Hopkins report that said that Chinese companies have pledged more than $227 billion to build EVs, chargers, batteries in other countries with clean technology. And let's not forget, over the past 10 years, now, China has electrified huge portions of its transportation and industrial sectors, and that's cut oil consumption by up to 1 billion barrels of oil today. And that's a good cushion to have right now with the disruptions at the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, you can catch the rest of that episode and related topics with our global team of reporters on our podcast, CNA Correspondent. It's, of course, available on our website, CNA or Me Listen apps, as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Right, on that note, I'm going to go for a short break now, but coming up next, China's largest trade fair, widely seen as a gauge of demand for Chinese exports, begins amid global uncertainty, driven by wars and tariffs. China's largest trade fair has opened its doors in the southern city of Guangzhou, where more than 32,000 exhibitors are showcasing their products spread over an area that's larger than, get this, 200 football fields. Well, running for almost a month, the Canton Fair is held twice a year and is widely seen as a barometer of China's foreign trade. And it comes amid slowing export growth in China amid the war in Iran. Products exhibited range from electronics and homeware to furniture, toys, and fashion. Well, the previous fair, according to organizers, attracted more than 310,000 overseas buyers from some 200 countries. Well, we've got Deborah Wong joining us live now from the fair in Guangzhou to help us unpack a little bit more here. So, Debs, tell us about China's exports and exporters. How are they affected by the Iran war?
So China is an export-reliant country, and so exporters have definitely experienced some shocks. In fact, export data in March actually fell from January and February, and IMF, in fact, even cut global growth forecasts in 2026 and also warned of possible recession. And we're already seeing some signals on the ground here at Canton Fair. In fact, the number of pre-registered buyers here fell from the previous edition in October. Let's hear more from the sellers.
美国其实我们有很多美国客户，他也要求说，不想要我们的牌子，他想要贴牌。那包括我们，其实我们的最大客户在中东，因为中东的风沙大，那么中东呢，就因为这个局势，导致我们的客户也已经对我们发了声明，禁止一切商业活动。那么在这个局势下面，那这些国家我们只能说暂时先放一放，我们去主攻别的国家，我们去集中在别的国家。
我们今天是第一天到展场，目前看来，其实中东的客户是有减少的。回电话的时候收到的信息就是机票的上涨，飞过来也不太方便。我们加大了线上的投入，来对客户进行一次就是长时间的这样的线上的沟通，来激活客户，来等待这个国际的这样的一些局势有所缓解，来再次邀约到中国。
So this is the world's largest trade event, and so we are going to be keeping very close watch on the figures. But, you know, it's only day one. The event will last for about a month, and we will need to look at the total number of buyers, of sellers, of the exhibitors, the total trade volume as well, sales, as well as the number of agreements inked to really get a fuller picture. But what's more important here is how we are observing sellers building resilience. So we did speak to some sellers earlier, and they're talking about shifting to long-term strategies. And these are strategies that we saw unfold during the pandemic as well. A lot of them are going online to communicate to clients who are not able to come to China this time round. And they are also focusing on regional development to sort of mitigate the broader geopolitical risks.
Now, I know we still haven't gotten the full picture, as you've mentioned, because, the event will go on a little bit longer. But so far from what we know, how has the crisis influenced buyer demand on the ground?
So buyers that we're speaking to, that we spoke to earlier, say they are a little bit more conservative in the kind of products that they're looking at, products that they are buying, because, operating costs is quite high at the moment. Lots of window shopping on day one. They want to spend more time to also look through the range of products on offer to see what fits into their long-term business strategy. And you've also heard earlier from sellers, buyer data, where they're coming from. That's also changed. Fewer clients from the Middle East, from the US, more clients, in fact, from South America as well as Southeast Asia. Now, these are economies that are they actually have friendlier trade ties with China, so it's not surprising here. Let's hear from more of them.
War, it's like disaster for the environment too, because they make petrol a lot expensive as well as gas. And we need to save energy. So I think it's a good timing for us to be here. We are really, really close to Antarctica. So climate change is really important for us. I've been looking at solar panels and wind panels as well. They use less power, which means we spend less energy.
Affected a lot because most of the flights that leaves Brazil, they stop in Middle East, such as Qatar and Dubai. So it was very hard for us because we needed to change our flights because of that, for example. And we are also concerned that we will affect in the price of the products because of the shipping costs.
But there are definitely some bright spots we've observed. There is an entire new energy resources segment that we will be visiting over the next few days. And, a lot of buyers are also interested in that. And that really aligns with China's push for clean energy, for green tech as well, creating companies that, in fact, will look into producing solar panels, wind turbines, and cooling systems. And all these are interesting to foreign buyers that we spoke to, because where we are looking at the energy crisis playing out, all these kind of sectors could actually fit into their longer business strategy. We spoke to an analyst to try to unpack the interest areas and why this is so significant. Have a listen.
So AI-powered factory automation and smart manufacturing offerings directly reduce buyers' production cost. A strong sell when margins are squeezed by the Iran war energy shock. And second is the clean tech product, solar, batteries, EVs, along with buyers' own energy transition pressures. Of course, there are headwinds. The higher operating costs globally means buyers prioritizing cost saving over exploring new technology sourcing.
But as much as that's positive, we also need to consider the dual nature of tech. It comes with its own set of security considerations. China, for instance, experiencing restrictions from the US in terms of high-tech imports and exports. And most recently, Europe has also cut funding for Chinese inverters in clean tech projects. And so, tech is going to be absorbing some shocks, but it's not going to be offering full immunity. Back to you.
And many thanks for that report. CNA correspondent Deborah Wong live from the massive Canton Fair venue in Guangzhou. Now, up to 8 million in the Asia-Pacific could be pushed into poverty with a prolonged war in the Middle East. Well, that's according to a new UN Development Program report, which projects job losses, rising inflation, and slower growth. Well, the report estimates that the conflict could wipe up to $299 billion from the region's GDP as governments strain to cushion rising costs. Well, the impact is already being felt through higher fuel costs. Rising oil prices are pushing up transport expenses and straining supply chains across the region. That's feeding into food inflation, with prices expected to rise sharply in the months ahead. Now, according to the UN, countries like Pakistan could see inflation rise by 5%. And the report also flags fertilizer supply as another key concern. Disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz are limiting access to the Middle East, threatening crop yields and pushing up food prices. Well, the risks are most acute for import-dependent economies such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Now, the report adds that countries including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and the Philippines could face added pressure from falling remittances as Gulf economies slow. The UNDP is urging countries across the region to turn crisis into opportunity by boosting energy self-sufficiency and building more resilient trade links. And on that note, we wrap up Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia and look us up on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.